"She's just a name on an old file," my father said to the estate lawyer across the table. "A clerical leftover from a marriage that ended 23 years ago." My stepmother nodded without looking at me. She straightened the cuff of her blazer and said, "We're not even sure the original paperwork was properly filed in this province." I sat across from them in that boardroom in downtown Calgary and said nothing. The lawyer representing my father's side, a sharp man named Hargrove, shuffled his documents and didn't once glance in my direction. To him, I was a procedural inconvenience, a line item to be struck. I was 31 years old. I had spent the last 8 years working as a forensic accountant with the Canada Revenue Agency. I had audited corporations worth more than my father would ever see in 3 lifetimes. But in that room, I was apparently just old paperwork. Let me tell you how I got there. My mother, Diane, met my father, Robert, in Saskatoon in the late 80s. They married young, had me at 24, and by the time I was 7 years old, the marriage was finished. I don't have many memories of them together that aren't framed in tension. Hushed arguments in the kitchen, the sound of a door closing too firmly, the particular silence that lives in a house where 2 people have stopped trying. My father left when I was 8. He didn't move far, just across the city, but he might as well have moved to another country. At first, there were weekend visits. Then there were phone calls. Then there were checks that arrived on my birthday, sometimes on time, sometimes 2 weeks late, always in the exact same amount regardless of what year it was, as though I had stopped aging at 9. My mother never spoke badly about him in front of me. That was her discipline, her particular brand of dignity. She worked as a registered nurse at Saskatoon City Hospital for 30 years. She raised me alone in a house on the east side of the city, and she made sure I had everything I needed, even when I knew she was stretching to make it work. She taught me to read financial statements before I could drive. She taught me that the most powerful thing a woman can do in a room full of people who underestimate her is stay quiet and let them finish. I didn't understand what she meant until I was sitting in that boardroom in Calgary. My father remarried when I was 12. Her name was Patricia, and she had 2 sons from her previous marriage, boys who were loud and easy and immediately folded into my father's new life like they had always been there. I watched from a distance. I attended the obligatory Christmas dinners for a few years, sat at the end of the table, answered questions about school in single sentences, and drove back to Saskatoon with my mother feeling like a guest who had been politely tolerated. I stopped going when I was 17. My father called to ask why. I told him the truth, that I didn't feel like I belonged there. And he said with genuine confusion in his voice, "Well, you never really tried to." That was the last real conversation we had for nearly a decade. I went to the University of Saskatchewan on a merit scholarship, studied accounting, graduated with distinction, wrote the CFE on my first attempt and passed all 3 days. I joined the CRA as a junior auditor at 23 and worked my way through increasingly complex files, small business audits, then corporate, then international tax structures, then the specialized unit that handles fraud investigations involving estate and trust manipulation. I was good at my job because I understood how people hide money. I understood the psychology of it, the belief that paperwork, if layered correctly, becomes reality. That if you file enough documents in the right order, you can make something true that wasn't. My mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer when I was 27. She told me on the phone, calmly, the way she delivered all difficult information, as though she had already processed it and was now simply passing it along. She said the prognosis was cautiously optimistic. She said she had a good oncologist. She said she had already updated her will and that I should know there was a TFSA and a small investment account that would come to me, along with the house, which was paid off. I moved back to Saskatoon for 6 months. I worked remotely and drove her to appointments and cooked dinners and sat with her through the evenings when the fatigue was worst. She recovered well. The cancer went into remission and stayed there. We had 3 more years that were, in some ways, the best of my life, unguarded and honest in the way that a brush with mortality makes possible. She died not from cancer. She died from a pulmonary embolism, suddenly, on a Tuesday morning in March. She was 61. She had been talking to a colleague on the phone and then she wasn't. I was back in Calgary when it happened. I got the call from her neighbor, Louise, who had found her. I flew back that afternoon. My father showed up at the funeral. I hadn't known he was coming. He stood at the back of the church in a gray suit and nodded at me across the room like we were colleagues at a conference. Patricia was not with him. His 2 stepsons were not there. Just him, alone, nodding. He found me by the reception table afterward and said, "She was a good woman." He said it with the tone of someone closing a file. I thanked him for coming and walked away. 3 weeks later, his lawyer contacted my mother's estate lawyer. My mother's will was clean and straightforward. The house, the TFSA, the investment account, all to me. She had also, and this was the part that apparently disturbed my father, listed me as the sole beneficiary on a small life insurance policy she had maintained for years. The total estate, including the house in a neighborhood that had appreciated considerably, was just over $680,000. My father's position, as communicated to Hargrove, was that because my parents had never formally completed the divorce proceedings, there had been a separation agreement signed in 1998, but the actual divorce order had apparently been delayed due to a filing error and then simply never finalized. He retained certain rights as a surviving spouse under Saskatchewan's intestacy and matrimonial property legislation. I want to be precise here because the law matters. Saskatchewan's Intestate Succession Act and the Matrimonial Property Act both carry provisions that, in certain circumstances, can give a surviving spouse a claim against an estate. My father's argument was that because the divorce was never legally finalized, he was technically still my mother's spouse and therefore entitled to make a claim. My mother's estate lawyer, a woman named Cynthia Okafor, was competent and thorough, but she hadn't worked a case quite like this before. The question of the incomplete divorce was real. The paperwork gap existed. My father's claim wasn't frivolous. It was, in fact, carefully constructed. That was when I understood that the man who had sent me birthday checks in the same amount for 12 consecutive years had, at some point, become someone who paid attention to documents. I hired my own legal counsel, a partner at a firm in Calgary who specializes in estate litigation. Her name was Margaret Tran, and she had the particular quality I have always admired in professionals. She listened completely before she spoke. I brought her everything. My mother's original separation agreement, the correspondence trail from 1998, the CRA tax filings, because my mother had filed as a single person every year since 1999, and my father had filed as a single person as well, which is a legal acknowledgement of marital status that carries its own weight. I brought her my father's remarriage certificate from 2001 because when he married Patricia, he had declared himself divorced on the marriage registration form. That last document was the one Margaret set down slowly. He declared himself divorced, she said, in writing. To the province of Saskatchewan, I said, to get a marriage license. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. Where did you get this? Vital statistics records are public, I said. For the marriage registration. I submitted a request 3 weeks ago. She made a note. You've done this before. I audit people for a living, I said. People who believe that paperwork, arranged correctly, becomes reality. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday morning. It was held in a boardroom at a neutral legal office in downtown Calgary. Beige carpet, a long table, a window looking out over the Bow River. My father and Patricia arrived together, which surprised me. Patricia had the composed expression of someone who had prepared for this the way you prepare for an unpleasant but manageable errand. My father looked older than I remembered. He had the slightly startled quality of a man who expected things to resolve themselves and was mildly affronted when they required his presence. Hargrove began with a summary of their position, the incomplete divorce, the matrimonial property provisions, the argument that my mother's estate was subject to spousal claim. He was precise and confident. He had clearly done this before. When he finished, the mediator turned to Margaret. Margaret opened her folder and placed 3 documents on the table. The first was my father's 2001 marriage registration to Patricia, with the checkbox clearly marked, previously married. Yes, marriage dissolved by divorce. Hargrove looked at it. He didn't say anything. The second was my father's tax returns from 1999 through 2004, obtained through proper legal process, each one filed under marital status, divorced. My father's jaw shifted slightly. The third was a letter, dated 2003, from my father's own previous lawyer to my mother's previous lawyer, confirming that both parties considered the marriage dissolved and that the failure to file the final divorce order had been a mutual administrative oversight that both parties had treated as resolved. Hargrove picked up the third document. He read it twice. Then he set it down. The mediator, a quiet man named David Lepage, who had said almost nothing up to this point, looked at Hargrove and asked, "Counsel, does your client wish to revise the basis of his claim, given these documents?" Hargrove looked at my father. My father looked at the table. Patricia looked at her hands. The silence in that room had a particular texture. It was the silence of a position collapsing. Hargrove said, carefully, "We may need a brief recess to confer with our client." During the recess, I stood by the window and looked at the river. Margaret stood beside me and said nothing. She understood that there was nothing to say. When we reconvened, Hargrove announced that his client was withdrawing the spousal claim. My father didn't look at me when Hargrove said it. He looked at a point somewhere past my left shoulder, the way people look when they are present in a room but have decided not to be. I didn't feel triumph. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the morning's work. I felt the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent years being peripherally dismissed and then had to spend money and time and legal resources to establish that they exist. But there was one more thing. After the session formally closed as we were gathering documents, my father stood up and, for the first time in years, looked directly at me. "I didn't think you'd fight it," he said. His voice was flat, not apologetic. Explanatory. I looked back at him. "I know," I said. He waited, as though I might say something else, as though I owed him context or anger or the kind of scene that would let him categorize me as difficult and move on. I didn't give him that. I zipped my bag, shook Margaret's hand, thanked David Lepage for his time, and walked out of that boardroom into the Calgary morning. My mother's house sold 4 months later. The TFSA and investment account were released to me without further complication. I kept 2 things from the house: a photograph of my mother at my university convocation, squinting against the sun and laughing at something I'd said, and the kitchen table where she had taught me to read a balance sheet. The table is in my apartment now. I work at it sometimes in the evenings, going through files. It's a good table. Solid, the kind that lasts. My father has not contacted me since the mediation. I don't expect that to change. I don't spend time being angry about it. Anger is a position, and positions require energy to maintain. What I have instead is clarity. A clean understanding of who showed up when it mattered and who didn't, who my mother was and what she built, and what it means to walk into a room where someone has decided you are a name on a file and walk out having proven, document by document, that you are considerably more than that. She raised me to stay quiet and let them finish. I did. And when they were done, there was nothing left to argue. There's something I've come to understand about the way consequences work, not as punishment, not as reward, but as a kind of arithmetic that life quietly runs in the background while we're busy making other choices. My father made a series of choices over 30 years. He chose to leave when I was 8 and let the distance grow comfortable. He chose to start a new family and fold himself so completely into it that his first daughter became, in his own words, a name on an old file. He chose, when my mother died, to see not a loss but a legal opportunity. And he chose to walk into that mediation room believing that paperwork, arranged carefully enough, could erase a person. What he didn't account for was that I had spent 8 years of my professional life studying exactly that belief, the belief that documents create reality. I had audited corporations that built entire false histories on paper. I had watched confident men sit across tables from CRA investigators and explain, with complete sincerity, why the numbers meant something other than what they said. They were always surprised when the arithmetic didn't agree. My father was surprised too. But here's what I want to say, because the story isn't really about him. What carried me through that morning wasn't anger, and it wasn't the satisfaction of being right. It was something my mother had built in me so gradually that I didn't recognize it as a gift until I needed it. She taught me that preparation is a form of self-respect, that staying quiet is not the same as being passive, that the most effective thing you can do when someone dismisses you is to let them finish, and then place the truth on the table without raising your voice. That's not a lesson you learn once, it's a discipline. It requires you to keep showing up for yourself even when no one else is, to keep building your knowledge and your record and your integrity even when the people who are supposed to cheer for you are conspicuously absent. It requires you to understand that the work you do in private, the files you study, the skills you develop, the character you build in ordinary moments, is what you will have to stand on when the extraordinary moment arrives. I think about the version of myself that might have existed if I had let my father's absence hollow me out. The version that spent energy on bitterness, or on trying to earn recognition from someone who had decided not to give it. That version would have walked into that boardroom unprepared or not at all. She would have deferred to Hargrove's confidence and let the claim proceed unchallenged. Instead, I walked in with 3 documents and said almost nothing. The table my mother left me is still in my apartment. I still work at it in the evenings. It is, as I said, a solid table, the kind that lasts. My mother understood something that took me longer to learn, that what you build quietly, honestly, and with full attention will outlast anything that was built to take it from you. Not because the world is fair, but because careful work is harder to undo than careless harm. The arithmetic eventually runs correctly. That's what I carried out of that boardroom. Not triumph, not closure, just the clear, steady knowledge that she raised me right, and that I had, finally, been worthy of it.